Who dares disturb my slumber?
X-Men 97 has been teasing us about the existence of the externals since the beginning of Season 2. The show has always had a knack for breaking the rules surrounding what a typical revival show really looks like. As you know, X-Men 97 is a direct sequel of X-Men the animated series from the 90s, and because the show has 3 decades worth of comics between the OG cartoon and now, it allows the writers of the current show to cherry-pick storylines or avoid any pitfalls through the 29 years of plot development. Now, the best part of the new show so far has been how it keeps circling back to the major unsolved loopholes from its predecessor. That is exactly why we might actually get to learn a lot about the externals in the coming episodes, especially with Candra appearing as a minor villain in the latest one. For many decades now, some of Marvel's most powerful mutants have existed only in the shadows, and despite their immense importance in the comics, the externals barely get the attention they deserve, as they're often eclipsed by Apocalypse. That is probably why people have been wondering about the externals since 1944 and spent all this time simply figuring out a certain mystery character from the 90s animated series, instead of doing a whole dramatic fanfare for announcing Candra's existence. X-Men 97 connected her existence to a much bigger storyline, especially after the original X-Men the animated series dug deep into Gambit's backstory and a whole blood feud between the Thieves and Assassins guilds. Candra was never given a real moniker, and all the animated series had explained was how she hibernates in the Louisiana Bayou and often gets summoned by the guilds when they needed power. But X-Men 97 changed this by quietly confirming her comic identity. So who is the mutant High Lord and what is her backstory? Without wasting another moment, let's get right into it.
Live from this world to a darkness never ending!
Who is Candra in both the animated series? Given that a lot of you might not have watched the OG animated series, I'm pretty sure you are scratching your heads about the mystery surrounding the external that everyone and their uncle have been discussing. This whole mystery around Candra's character first came up in Externally Yours, which was the 6th episode of Season 2 of X-Men the animated series. This episode actually focused heavily on Gambit, as it took us right at the center of the bitter rivalry between the Thieves Guild and the Assassins Guild. According to the storyline, both guilds were expected to pay a tithe every 10 years to a mysterious being known as the External, who provided them with power and protection in exchange. Now, by this point, Gambit had already been exiled from the Thieves Guild for long enough. However, he was forced to return home after his brother, who had been chosen to serve as that decade's tithe-bearer, was kidnapped by the Assassins. What made the whole mystery even more interesting was that the episode never actually revealed what the External was or who was behind the name. It was simply left hanging, and since then it became one of the strangest unanswered questions in the entire 90s series. And because the show never returned to it, we were left to speculate about the External's true identity long after the series had ended. But that mystery finally got resolved in X-Men 97's Rise of Apocalypse Part 2, where Pharaoh Ramatut, aka Kang, is shown with a priestess who looked strikingly similar to the External from the 90s series. Of course, that episode never actually named her, but the closing credits did confirm that she was indeed Candra, which sort of fits neatly with the way the character has been portrayed throughout Season 2. For those who do not know, Candra is an immortal mutant known as an External, who are basically a rare group of mutants that cannot truly die unless they are killed by another External. These are basically a group of very, very long evil mutants with incredible powers, and somehow through the comics, in one way or another, these mutant High Lords seem to play some form of part in all of Apocalypse's evil plans and mostly keep popping up in stories related to him. Not just that, even though their origin, abilities, and limitations have mostly been theoretical in nature, one thing I can be sure about is their long-term involvement in human politics, finance, and law. Call them mutant Illuminati, if you will. These 10 subspecies of mutants all have the gift of immortality, but the rules relating to the externals are still somewhat undefined. Apart from their primary mutation, every external has their power of immortality kick in after their first death. When they meet a normal end, these High Lords are usually resurrected by externals, and since then they remain stuck at the same age during which they died, for all eternity. These guys are apparently all linked with one another and can also sense each other from a distance. They can basically feel the arrival of a new High Lord and even detect when their streak of immortality is activated, meaning externals can sense when one of them is killed or rises from the dead. This innate connection not only separates them from other immortals, but also allows them to summon their fellow externals across vast distances by effectively pulling each other into their presence through teleportation, which basically lets them congregate in no time. Every external apparently embodies an intangible concept, and their group includes Saul, who represents patience, Absalom, who represents despair, Gideon, who represents opportunity, Burke, who stands for fortitude, Selene, who represents corruption, Candra, who represents guile, and Cruel, who stands for ferocity. These 8 names usually form the self-claimed High Lords who love playing power games while manipulating everything from behind the scenes. You might not be surprised to learn that Apocalypse is also an external who represents evolution, of course, but the 10th external is believed to be Cannonball, whose existence as an external was brought into question by one of the High Lords, and so the whole discussion on who the 10th external really is often left up in the air. Now, the only way these guys can really be stopped from resurrecting is after they are killed by one another. And doing so not only allows the other to gain the powers of the external they killed, but also elevates them to a godlike status. Even these High Lords have an immortal healing factor. You should know that they are not exactly invulnerable, which means they suffer wounds just like anybody else, and will simply regenerate back to life if they are mortally wounded. However, even for an external, killing another one is not an easy feat by any chance, because they can only die if the High Lord severs the 5 branches, which probably includes removing the limbs from their body before decapitating them. But that too is a misdirection, because the real vulnerable point of an external is the heart, which is linked to the external force of power, and destroying that kills them for good. Even then, as long as this external force permeates the earth, it is possible for an external to return in some form or manner. It is said that some of these externals have eventually managed to restore themselves to their original bodies. Anyway, coming back to Candra, like I've said before in the show's version of her history, Candra is basically an ancient being who gave both the Thieves Guild and the Assassins Guild their power, which explains why she was known as the External in the original 90s series. Now, one of the most important moments come in X-Men 97 Season 2, when Apocalypse rises to power, and soon after, Rama-Tut is revealed to be Kang the Conqueror. As Kang prepares to escape, he abandons his followers, including Candra. However, before he leaves, he tells her that her destiny begins that very day, while adding that Apocalypse can only be challenged by a force that is external. That seemingly simple line ends up setting the stage for everything that follows as the show adds to the story in the more recent episode, where Candra eventually takes a portion of Apocalypse's power for herself and becomes the External, giving new meaning to Kang's earlier warning. It is a great example of the series playing the long game by planting a seemingly minor detail and then circling back to its seasons later in a way that connects neatly with the comics. Having Kang deliver those particular words makes the payoff even more satisfying, especially for people like us who remember the External from the original animated series, because then the connection suddenly becomes clear. At the same time, it also allows the modern series to build on its 90s history, while staying closely tied to the source material without making the callback feel like it was simply added for the sake of nostalgia. In fact, in the latest episode of X-Men 97, we find out that after Kang dipped, Candra started serving Apocalypse as his priestess and even as his romantic partner. Apparently, they got married, and that is how she received a portion of Apocalypse's power through a glowing gem that she still has in the show's current timeline. However, eventually Candra ended up turning against Apocalypse after still having retained some bitterness from the past, and following that she traveled to America in the present timeline to become the swamp goddess we know and love. Honestly, I love how the show took elements from Nephi and Genesis, where basically two of the former lovers that Apocalypse had, and then combined those details in Candra's story. It definitely expands the role for someone like Candra, whose character has always been a bit two-dimensional at all fronts. Having said that, I think the most interesting thing about Candra at the moment is her connection to Gambit, which brings us back to X-Men 97. As you know, in the latest episode, Gambit was resurrected by Apocalypse, following which he sets his sights on Candra. Remy is basically out to steal the gem that contains the portion of Apocalypse's power that he had given to Candra very long ago. Now, Dark Gambit is equipped with a whole new set of abilities that the series has yet to fully explain, but we see him transform all the members of the Assassin's Guild into new horsemen before sending them after the same jewel. It is actually Belladonna who eventually summons the External for Gambit, and Candra was clearly surprised to see that it was Remy who brought her out of her long slumber. When Gambit demanded a gem, she refused to hand it over, and so he stabbed Candra and killed her before taking the stone for Rogue, just so they could be immortal together. Candra was genuinely shocked that Gambit, out of all people, was able to kill her, thus bringing a surprisingly quick end to a mystery that had been hanging around since the original animated series. In the end, we see Rogue use the power from Candra's external stone during the climatic battle, thus helping break Gambit free from Apocalypse's control during their confrontation inside Professor Xavier's mind. But I wonder if Candra, being the immortal external that she is, can really be dead. Something tells me we may not have seen the last of her yet. What do you guys think? What is Candra's origin story in the comics, and how did she receive her powers? So in the comic lore, Candra made her first appearance in the first issue of the Gambit comics that was by Howard Mackie and Lee Weeks. She apparently spent decades as one of Gambit's most persistent adversaries, and unlike Selene, Gideon, or even Apocalypse himself, Candra never cared to join the other externals in forming the High Lords. Instead, she preferred working solo as a power broker, infamous for cutting deals rather than building alliances. Even if we have no clue when the externals first banded together as the self-proclaimed High Lords, their earliest known shenanigans date back to the late 12th century, when they came together to get Candra to join them. But like I said, Candra did not want to join them, and instead of sharing her powers, she chose to play the power broker by herself by extracting her life energy and storing it inside a gem. She called Selene, Saul, Cruel, Nicodemus, and En Sabanur to help her with the ritual, and as she lay down on an altar with a stone in hand, as the others stood around her, En Sabanur took a blade of unknown energy and pierced it into her heart. While he did feel he could simply take her powers at that moment, Selene stopped him. Anyway, the blade disappeared, and after Noor placed the glowing stone in Candra's chest, a surge of energy sparked around it, thus indicating that the ritual was complete. While the gem did allow Candra to protect herself, without it she was severely vulnerable and did not have full access to her abilities. I think that single detail from the comics is what became the entire engine of her arc in X-Men 97. Because losing the gem makes her very mortal, and yet, for centuries, Candra has used it to strike a bargain with the New Orleans thieves and assassins guilds by granting them power in exchange for a tithe. Having said that, Candra has been called as the benefactress and Candra of the Floating Spires before she even became an external who represents guile in the tapestry of the infinite. However, we know very little about her early history, but she once mentioned that nearly 1,000 years ago, a mortal managed to obtain an external heart, which was an event that apparently came at a very heavy cost for her. Beyond that, most of what we know about her past is tied to her dealings with the High Lords and her heart gem, which is also known as the Heart of Eternal Darkness. I guess her history becomes much more clearer in the comics once she gets involved with the Thieves Guild and Assassins Guild in New Orleans, as well as the Egyptian Thieves Guild, although everything that happened before those connections remain largely a mystery, thus leaving a significant part of Candra's origins unexplored. And well folks, that brings us to the very end of this video. If you have not figured it out yet, in the comics lore, Candra actually did not get her powers from Apocalypse, rather her powers were innate, and all she did was pour her life force into her heart gem. That is a very important distinction between her comic book history and the newer X-Men 97 interpretation. But even then, it somehow still works. Having said that, which iteration of Candra's origin story do you like better? And more importantly, do you think there is a possibility of her coming back from the dead? I mean, externals cannot really die, but Remy did kill her after taking away her heart gem. So, what do you guys think? Let us know about your thoughts and theories in the comment box down below. As always, if you love this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. A subscription is the best way to be updated on all things X-Men 97. This is the V of Marvelous Videos, and I'll be seeing you in the next one.